And so what I'm hoping today that I can do is open up a dialogue around what transgenerational trauma is and what that looks like within our field as mental health practitioners. And then Stephen will be able to kind of go a little bit deeper into also how that plays a role in state-based functioning and looking at how do we begin to heal from within. So as Dr. Perry introduced, I started off a nonprofit. It's called Her Wellness Institute. It stands for Healing Intergenerational Roots. And really at the heart of what we do is to understand that we are healing not just for ourselves, but for the generations that came before us and the generations that have yet to be here. And so this is really near and dear to my heart. And the work has taken me into many brilliant spaces, and I've met some amazing people who are not just folks on the front line, but really warrior healers who want to be able to come together and make a difference so that we're not here in another 30 years having another civil rights movement about the same topics. Yeah. So again, I want to, if any of my, as somebody who is an Indigenous person, I like to be able to start off with always saying that what I bring to you today is really just what I've learned along my way. Sometimes I've learned it from my elders and my community members, and I can learn it from my children, and I learn it from the people that I work with. And so I share all of this work with my humility and also the knowledge of those who continue to add to my understanding around this work. Right now, what we're experiencing, oh, can you see my slides? Can you see my slides?
Not yet.
Oh, can we share my slides?
Can you share? Do you have sharing privileges on the bottom there?
Let me see. Oh, sorry about that. I started sharing my slides and you all can't see it. So, hold on. Yes, sorry.
Technology, the gift that keeps on giving.
Well, okay. Just, yep, here we go. All right. Can you all see it now?
Yes.
Oh,
definitely.
Wonderful. Okay, so again, like I said, I'm going to do this in about 20 minutes. So hold on to your pants. And I am definitely around for further dialogue. You can email me and we can connect and we can Zoom and we can have a deeper dialogue around this because I am going to have to move through some of this information in a thoughtful but also expedited way. I'm on is tribal land in the city of Milwaukee. And what we are hosting at the moment is a unity fire that's being put on by our community members. It's a way for us to be able to raise awareness on Black Lives Matter. And really what I feel is also Black lives are sacred. And so my son and some of my staff members, their sons have come to be part of this unity fire and be the fire keepers over this fire has been going on for 4 days, and it goes for 24 hours. Every day there are people that are tending to this fire and putting good medicine, good prayers out for healing that is needed. And I wanted to just bring that to this forefront as I share. So when I look at where do we begin? Where do we begin the conversation around transgenerational trauma? You can have a lot of different angles on this, and there's a lot of work that has been done, research with Holocaust survivors, research around the slave syndrome. There has been really empowering conversations by people of color who are adding to this. I want to take us, I'm a little bit more of a historian, and one of the things that I like to be able to bring us to is looking at maybe where some of the roots of white supremacy and racism has begun. And really it was over 500 years ago. And that's where our story for today, at least where I will take it, will begin. The doctrine discovery, if you're not familiar with it, was a way to be able to go into lands and take what you needed. People became commodities. Not only were people commodities, but the land, something that is very sacred to many people around the world who are indigenous, also were seen as commodities, things that could be sold. And I want to be able to start here for you to understand that this has been a really long-rooted experience that needs to be, I often talk about decolonizing these practices. One thing I want to point out is that just on this slide, it says, whatsoever held and possessed by them to reduce their persons to perpetual slavery and to apply and appropriate to himself and his successors, the kingdoms, the dukes, the counties, the principalities, to be able to convert them to his and their use and profit. This is where I want to begin, because at the end of the day, when we look at the impact of human trafficking, when we look at the impact that we're having with within our communities, this understanding of people being not seen in the same value is really important to hold and understand where that comes from. On Turtle Island, which is what we often will refer to as North America from an indigenous perspective, is that this has been an ongoing conversation within our families and has impacted families through genocide, colonization, slavery. These things I know that many of you who are on this call are already aware of. But maybe what you're not aware of is the unity that has continued to be in the background of our work. You are sacred. And understanding that indigenous sovereignty and Black liberation and for people of color, looking at the story of how this impacts our mental health, it's not just been something that has impacted us in one generation. It has been generation after generation after generation, holding these stories on our backs, holding these stories within our families, and learning how to navigate and continue to grow beyond the pain that is there. See, really the way that I see it, and this is at least from the angle that I take, is that it has to deal with relationship to land. Land has been, environmentally, land has been the way that people have been able to be controlled. That's seen as a way, relationship with land and people as goods, relationship with race, and when did that start? And then also looking at relationship within our families and our cultures, and watching families and communities be dismantled by this system of oppression. The conversation around Indian boarding schools, or the conversation around when we look into the impact that slavery has continued really to have within our modern day culture. Nothing's changed in over 500 years. Maybe we call it something different. Maybe we've put a new name to it, but the intent is still there. See, when I look at mental health and transgenerational trauma, I really want to look at the impact it's had, not just on our land, but our bodies. Understanding that helps us to navigate this space a bit differently. When I do full day and sometimes 3-day presentations, really workshops, I look at decolonizing the pedagogy and practice of white supremacy rooted within the medical and mental health practice. We have to understand that the current system that we use is really based on a system that was meant for a few and to be able to control others through how we look at mental health, mental illness, and mental wellness. So Dr. Walters describes historical intergenerational trauma as an event or a series of events with genocidal or ethnocidal intent to systematically eradicate a group of people and their way of life who share a specific group or identity. At the beginning of the 20th century, Clifford Beers founded Mental Health of America, and it was for mental hygiene. Something that I think within our own field we have to come to terms with, I hope we come there sooner than later, is understanding that what the pictures you're looking at right now is looking at how people of color, specifically Black and brown people, have been used for being sterilized. If you're not familiar with the picture that it has the woman here on the medical table, awful procedures have been done in the name of our medical and mental health story for us to learn about how to use certain medicines or use certain practices. If you're not familiar with the Hiawatha Insane Asylum, it was the only insane asylum that was meant just for Native American people, and of the people that went in, no one really ever left. Our history goes deep in white supremacy, and it's hard sometimes to unweave what has been woven when we're trying to find out where do we stand on these lines. When I look at and I understand where would we have to go when it comes to really having a deeper dialogue around addressing individual and community transgenerational trauma, it starts with understanding our collective and shared history together. It starts with understanding what we have learned in school, what we have done as clinicians, and often what we are taught is to look at things from a very individualized perspective, looking at somebody's presenting what they're struggling with as an endogenous experience. Transgenerational trauma asks us to look beyond just the individual. It asks us to understand the layers that come with somebody. We can get into conversations around epigenetics, and I always want to just caution us when we do that there are things like eugenics and other conversations that can happen when we look at this from one worldview. We understand that epigenetics also is a piece of resilience, it's a piece of strength, it's a piece of passing down the things that have helped us survive and even thrive. Transgenerational effects of trauma occur via a variety of mechanisms, including the impact of attachment, relationship with caregivers, the impact on parenting and family functioning, the association with parental, physical, and mental illness, disconnection and alienation from extended family, culture, and society. These effects are exacerbated by exposure to continuing high levels of stress and trauma, including multiple bereavements and other losses. The process of vicarious traumatization, where children witness the ongoing effects of original trauma, which a parent or other family member has experienced, even where children are protected from traumatic stories of their ancestors. The effects of the past trauma still impact on children in the form of ill health, family dysfunction, community violence, psychological morbidity, and early mental health. See, where we're at is I live in Milwaukee, and in Milwaukee, we're no stranger to the conversation around race and segregation. In fact, it was just recently that Milwaukee was looked at as declared racism as a public health crisis. We look at redlining, how land has been used and continues to be used to keep people imprisoned in spaces with invisible ropes and invisible cages. It's important to understand how land and how our ways of history continue to inform our practices and our policies. I often say to my staff, our environment has the opportunity to increase our vulnerability, our risk, or shape our resilience. We have been flooded with toxic stress. I share this because in order to understand the impact that trauma has within yourself and those who you are helping, we must understand the history that is there. See, this story continues, and it will continue for my children, and it will continue for their children if we choose not to change the frequency of the way that we navigate this space. I've used the NM model to not just inform my practice, but I've used it to inform the way I organize my organization. I've used it to inform the way that I do community gatherings. I've used it to inform the way that I have my staff provide our practices and our programming. The model is, and not to just, pat you on your back, Dr. Perry, but is incredibly brilliant and simple in a way that allows us to be able to have a deeper conversation on what matters. See, what we continue to do is we continue to go into spaces and protest, because that does make change, but it hasn't made the change that we need. It makes us get a little bit further, and we need to keep doing it. But see, when we look at where we're at today, we're repeating history. We're repeating history in a way that continues to say, if you look at this woman's face over here, she says, white silence costs lives. Imagine what it is that she's experiencing as well in her body. It has become something that we carry. When we think about the dosing of how often we are seeing imagery coming in our, whether it's our cell phones or our news or our friends or somebody sending us something, there is no respite from it. And there is the need and the demand to do something about it. These pictures are from Wisconsin. They're actually from people that I know who saw this in our space. The gentleman on the left was somebody that a friend of mine took this photo. He is a neo-Nazi. And on the right, these were just taken the last couple days. This was a man walking his dog. See, when the environment informs you, nothing is safe. And here is why this matters. As somebody of color, if I am walking into a space and I see that I am not invited into that space, I shrink my body. My shoulders go down. My face looks down. On a cellular level, what is that doing to me? What is that doing internally to me? When I think about the gut reaction, the tensing of my muscles, where am I headed in that time? Am I able to make decisions that are informed? Or am I feeling a sense of threat? And in that threat, if you can't escape that threat, that becomes an everyday toxic flooding. These felt senses are huge because not only are we seeing them on imagery, we're seeing them when we go to the gas station or drive down the street. I came up with the term, my work is really rooted in historical trauma research within our Native community. I also did some research within our African American community here in Milwaukee, and that's not ready to be published, so I'm not sharing that today. But the findings are very similar, and that is, I have something that is called persistent toxic systems and environments. It's a term that I coined after I did my research. These are everyday environmental, traumatic, or stressful events that negatively impacts one's mental, emotional, spiritual, and physical health outcomes. It is repeated and regular exposure to
Sorry, Leah. I muted everybody because of someone who was making noise in the background. So for the last 20 seconds, we haven't heard you. So if you can unmute you, I'm trying to unmute you, but if you push your mic, since you're a co-presenter, there you go.
I got it. I'm good.
Okay.
Thank you.
Sorry.
You're okay. You're okay. We got this. So PTSD is something that came out of my research, if you didn't catch that. It was understanding that our land informs us, the environment. I often call this triple attunement. I know many of us might know of dual attunement, but triple attunement is understanding how the environment around us is informing our, not just externally, but internally. Right? So when we're thinking about state-based functioning, we're thinking about the central nervous system, the sympathetic, the parasympathetic nervous system, how all of this is being informed as we walk into spaces. This is huge. When we are somebody that walks into a space that feels like we are not safe, it starts everywhere. And it's many of us who are of color have experienced this in spaces that maybe others feel very safe and comfortable walking. So PTSD is these everyday environmental, traumatic, stressful events that negatively impact one's mental, emotional, spiritual, and physical health outcomes. It is repeated and regular exposure to toxic surroundings and systems that are felt, seen, heard, and interpreted by individuals as inescapable barriers or hardships. Here's a little bit of my research. And I share this because it's important, because I saw very similar outcomes with the African American community here in Milwaukee when I did the research on historical trauma here. And what you'll see is when we look at the adverse childhood experiences, something was deeper. About 50% of our people that were First Nations, Native American, that took the ACEs reported having 3 or 4 or more ACEs. When we look at the other, if we compare it to Wisconsin or Kaiser studies, we'll see that, 14% is a huge number, right? When we look at a population. Now, this is a sample size, and I met with over 200 people, and we had about 111 people that this is representing right now. And what we found was that historical loss was something that was much deeper than just seeing and feeling racism. It actually went to the loss of culture and knowledge. It went to distrust of white people. It went to early death. It looked at loss of being able to have cultural and traditional ways. When we look at the impact that slavery has had on not just generations, but all the communities and the cultures that had to be dismantled, forgotten. This is what we would probably see. The loss of language and tradition and culture, spiritual ways that were there. Perceived loss is huge, but what do you do with that disenfranchised grief? Where do you put it? And what this research showed was that two things came out. Really, one was shame and avoidance, and the other one was anger and depression. And see, from a traditional mental health perspective, you might try and treat that anger and depression in a way that would not get to the core. And so often people say, this isn't getting to what I need. There's something deeper there. A lot of our communities of color, there's a lot of distrust for working with our clinicians that are therapists, specifically if they're white therapists. And a lot of this comes from just people not understanding or knowing how deep this story goes. And one individual who took my study, he called it the chain of pain. And in fact, one of the questions that I asked was not just did you have historical loss and did you have associated historical loss symptoms, but I also looked at discrimination, felt discrimination, because that is huge at what we're looking at when it comes to mental health and mental well-being. And 76% of the individuals that said they reported experienced discrimination. I will say that the study that I have not been able to share today that has our African American population mirrors this. So from that research of understanding historical trauma as transgenerational trauma, I created this model. It's a simplistic model, but really what it looks at is understanding how the in-between of the generational experiences of persistent trauma and stress environments, those things continue to inform not just ourselves, but our generations. A parent's chain of pain and community's legacy. I'm not sure if you had the opportunity to watch this TikTok, and if you have not, it's about 30 seconds long. I do encourage you to find it and watch it. See, as a mother, I had a hard time watching this one. Little girl says, I could die for the color of my skin. What you might see are tears and anxiety, and it might look like depression, but do not pathologize that. What she feels is real and inescapable for her family. How do you treat that? I ask you as therapists, as counselors, as mental health providers, how are you supporting that? How are you supporting that healing? You know, another thing is that there's a wonderful article that came out, and I took this from a LinkedIn page on my LinkedIn, and it's the emotional impact of watching white people wake up to racism. You know what? Welcome to the table. But you know, the work has to be done, and at least from my perspective, you have to be the one that does it. What becomes emotionally exhausting is having to explain over and over why dismantling racism and the system of oppression matters. We've been here. It started long ago, and we all inherited this, but we don't have to continue it. What happens when mourning has been halted? Well, we have anticipatory grief. That feeling like it's going to happen again, where do we go with it? That feeling of it happened already and it's never going to end. We have disenfranchised grief. We must be able to heal and repair from oneself, within relationships, and together. Now, I won't have a lot of time. I have to wrap up soon. So I want to get through some of these slides, but know that I'm open to having a deeper dialogue with you. We are in the NM community together, and I'm here for you.
Take your time, Leah, if you need a little bit more time.
Okay. See, the thing is, in mental health, what we have done is we look at this iceberg, and I love this iceberg. I wish it wasn't as blurry for you. It is a beautiful one. It is not mine. I wish it was. I know it's Tracy. I think it's Farwell. If you know her work, oh my gosh. But we look at anger, and we want to treat that anger. And the thing is, there's so many more layers to it. And it goes to that intergenerational level. But then before we can actually go there, we have to understand that it's unspoken. It's in the body. It's in our bodies. And putting words to it is difficult. Oh, I'm sorry. Somebody wants to take control of my screen. Do I accept it? Not sure. Sorry.
Don't accept it. I have
Okay.
no idea who's doing that, but
Yeah, I would say no.
Not good. Don't do it.
Okay. So when we look at how do we understand historical trauma, we must go deeper. We must understand the impact it has, not just for others, but cellularly on our self. How are we being impacted? Historical trauma, unresolved grief, has generations that have not mourned. That makes it really complex. And I will say that one of the most powerful ways that I have seen my community heal is through the process of ceremony. We must sometimes reenact. We must sometimes release. But we need to do so in a process that allows us to be able to heal beyond. Dr. Yellow Horse Braveheart, Dr. Bonnie Duran, Dr. Michael Yellowbird, these are the folks that I have learned so much from around historical trauma. And I will say that when we look at the unresolved grief that continues and it compiles and it becomes that anticipatory grief and it becomes then complex and developmental trauma, these pieces are deep, and we are at a point in our profession that we need to know what to do with this information. It cannot remain theory. Dr. Perry has seen this. I shared this with him a couple years ago. But the way that I looked at it is that environmental healing is place and land-based. So I took Dr. Perry's model and I said, you know, I look at healing from a very indigenous perspective. And what that is our first relationship was water. And if our first relationship was water, that means in the womb. How is water treated in our communities of color? Is there safe drinking water? Is it healing? Is it accessible? Food deserts, right? I look at how being in the womb and having smells and sounds and the medicines, you know, with me right now, I have a tobacco tie and it's sitting with me. The smell of the tobacco tie for prayer does something for me on a cellular level. Before I walked into this room, this is our medicine room that I'm in right now. I had one of my team members, she chanted in Hawaiian for me before I walked in, so that we could bring our ancestors' mana energy into the space. So relationships with our non-human relatives are really important. And it's critical to be able to understand how this informs our healing. If you live in an environment that is burning down, figuratively or realistically, compared to an environment that you can walk around, you can see the grass and the trees. We call it nature therapy. Really, it's that we were meant to have safety in our environment. So how do you, I have only one more slide. How do you begin to have this deeper dialogue about racism? Over here is where most of us go. Reason, right away. Looking at the overt white supremacy and then the covert white supremacy, and we get really bogged down in the dialogue. And I will tell you, please slow down, because we will not get there if we rush. First, understand your energy. As Stephen said in the beginning, how have you been feeling through this entire time? Did your stomach knot up? Did you have tightness in your throat? Did your shoulders start to go up to your ears? What did you start to do? Did you have to check your phone because something maybe was said that was a little uncomfortable, an image that was hard to watch? We have to first check within and understand what we bring. And then we can start to understand what is that connected to, right? I know within Dr. Perry's work, we look at the, at state-based functioning, we're saying, hey, if you're in this other side of threat response and you are in the brainstem or the dicephalon, it's not a good place for you to get into a deep conversation, or probably around race and white supremacy. It's also where we need to be able to repair our system. Often I'll talk about decolonizing mental health, but the first system we have to decolonize is our own system within. We have to be able to look at how do we relate to ourselves first, and then understand where we are with others before we can even entertain the idea of what is in the category that I have here for reason. Decolonizing mental health means decolonizing it within ourselves. It means asking different questions. It means understanding that our story as a profession started somewhere that wasn't meant for everybody. It means that not everything's going to work for the communities of color that you are supporting and being an ally or an advocate or steward with. Racism is a social disease and white supremacy is an illness. As a practitioner, my question for you is, what are you doing to understand how to address racism and white supremacy? As you do depression, anxiety, ODD, ADHD, psychosis, or suicidal ideation, because instead of looking at us and finding out what the symptoms are as a response to generations of loss and pain, what are you doing to look at the system that helped to create it? And I leave you on this. I need my stories to heal. I need my songs to sing as I heal. I need to heal others so I can heal. And I need you to validate my story and need to be healed by my traditions. I need my mother's stories. I need my father's stories. I need my grandmother's stories. I need to know the preciousness of my body. I need to take back all the hurt and pain, to wrap it up and send it on its way, because I need to forgive. I need to heal beyond myself and within my generations. We need radical healing. And so I say to all of my colleagues here that this conversation deserves more than I just gave it. I took us through it pretty quickly. But I also know that we have some pretty brilliant folks on the line right now. And I know that you'll be able to take something from this, and it is going to spark something in you. And for that, I say thank you. Mahalo nui loa for listening.